I'll build you a temple. The Juhu story by Giriraj Swami. I've heard so much about this book that I thought, I've got to read it. And I couldn't think of a nicer way to read it than reading it with other devotees. So I plan to just read, and let's see what happens. I don't think there'll be like discussion and all those kinds of things afterwards. The title of Chapter 1, Arriving on the Scene, a Good Fight. October 1970 through October 1973. In August 1970, after 5 years in the United States, Srila Prabhupada prepared to return to India with some of his American disciples. When he was asked why he was going to India, when his Guru Maharaj had ordered him to preach in the West, he replied, "I have already done that. Spread Krishna consciousness in Europe and America. Now I want to revive the spiritual culture of India." One of the first things Prabhupada did when he got to Calcutta was introduce Life Membership, a program meant to distribute books, generate funds for his projects, and engage important people in Krishna consciousness. By the terms of the program, a life member would contribute 1,111 rupees and receive in exchange for the duration of his or her life all of Prabhupada's books, present and future. A subscription to Back to Godhead, and, very dangerous here, free accommodations in any of our centers and guest houses throughout the world. Woo, woo, woo. Before leaving for India, Prabhupada had asked that each of our 14 temples or so, temples in America, send the best man they could spare, generally the second in command, to join him. Pretty much every devotee wanted to get to be with Prabhupada in India, and I was chosen to go from Boston. So, that October, I was on my way to India, and in Brussels, I first met 3 of Prabhupada's earliest and most prominent disciples, Yamuna, Shyamasundara, and Shyamasundara's wife, Malati, with their 2-year-old daughter, Saraswati. Guru Das, Yamuna's husband, whom I had met in Boston, was also with them. He had arranged a cheap flight on a small airline, and that evening 11 of us, with Shamsundar, who stayed behind to escort 4 more devotees from America the following day, boarded an old, converted, dual-propeller cargo plane bound for Bombay with a stop in Cairo. Ooh. In my mood of single-minded Krishna consciousness, I was practically oblivious to things around me. I wanted to avoid Maya, anything that could distract me from Krishna, and didn't pay much heed to anything that didn't relate directly to my service. I was focused on chanting and hearing every word of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, and on always thinking about Krishna, never forgetting him. I had heard that Prabhupada said that if you had trouble hearing, you should chant loudly, and sometimes to avoid any possible lethargy while chanting, I would jump up and down. There was some anxiety in the group about how people in Egypt might react But I was fixed. There was unrest in Cairo. President Gamal Abdel Nasser had recently died, and when we landed, we were met on the tarmac by soldiers and armed security guards with bandoliers of bullets strapped across their chests and machine guns slung over their shoulders. As we deplaned, they followed us with their machine guns. Stepping down the mobile stairway, Yamuna noticed the guards shifting their aim behind her, the muzzles of their guns pointing up, then down. When she turned to see what they were aiming at, there I was behind her, jumping up and down as I chanted. On the tarmac, Chidananda set up an altar on a table, and we began kirtan. Crowds of onlookers surrounded us and watched from the terminal's windows and balconies, leaning over the railings to smile and wave at us below. I was elated. Not only were we on our way to the Holy Land of India, but now we were chanting and dancing in exotic Muslim Egypt. And all these people were getting the benefit of hearing the holy names. After leading the chanting for some time, I addressed the soldiers and other people gathered around us. Then I took two of the soldiers by the hand and pulled them into the kirtan, and they sang and danced and laughed in enjoyment. Those were the days. Nanda Kumar had been playing cartels, but feeling anxious about the potential dangers of the situation, he had circled around the plane to chant by himself and pray for protection. When I came back, he later described, the first thing I saw was two machine guns leaning against the bus and Giri Maharaj holding one guy in each hand. And these Egyptian military guys were jumping up and down and chanting Hare Krishna with big grins on their faces. Break in the writing. When we arrived in Bombay, we didn't know what to expect. We were filled with excitement and expectation. We were finally in the Holy Land of India, Bombay. And would soon be meeting up with Srila Prabhupada and embarking on great adventures in Krishna consciousness. At the airport, while we were wondering what to do and where to go, we were met by a man wearing a brown fedora who asked us to come with him. For some reason, Guru Das thought he was a detective, so he asked for the man's identification. In response, the man showed Guru Das a telegram from Prabhupada addressed to Guru Das, in charge, unquote, telling Guru Das to go with the man to his home and wait for Prabhupada to join us there in a week's time. The man was Kailash Seksaria, Seksaria, with whom, through his uncle, the wealthy Calcutta Marwari businessman Ram Niwas Dandaria, Prabhupada arranged for us to stay. So, we all got into ambassador cars and headed in a caravan to Mr. Seksaria's house. Cars, buses, and motorbikes all sped down the street, horns blaring, barely avoiding crashing into each other. Or knocking into bicycles and crowded rickshaws drawn by skinny, sinewy men through the traffic. I was intrigued, but also a little fearful. And amidst all this chaos were cows, sacred cows, our mothers. When I saw them, my heart was filled with joy. Mr. Seksaria's residence, Seksaria Bhavan, or house, was a 7-story, creamy beige stone mansion facing the Arabian Sea on the corner of affluent Marine Drive, the Queen's Necklace, unquote. The entrance, flanked with vines and bushes, had dark green marble facing the front and lighter green on the sides, with gleaming white marble front steps. One entered a foyer through 2 carved wooden doors, and beyond that was a small marble entryway with a stairway and 2 elevators. The first that I'd seen in a private residence, on top of one of which stood a 2-foot square clock. Paragraph. Almost immediately upon entering, I could feel and was touched by the devotional culture of the entire household. Hired Brahmins cooked for the whole extended family in a huge white tiled kitchen, next to which was a deity room where all the food was offered. Other than Srila Prabhupada's disciples and followers, I had never met anyone who offered his or her food to Krishna before eating. Throughout the building, elderly ladies sat performing puja for deities of Krishna, housed in small temple structures less than 3 feet tall, ringing bells, offering incense, lamps and flowers, and reciting prayers. Mr. Sheikh Saria had arranged quarters for us on the ground floor. Quote, the windows had white bars arranged in a pattern that resembled a key, Jamuna recalled later. The top of the key, round and coming down to a half moon at the bottom. I envisioned it to be the key with which Srila Prabhupada would unlock India for me, as he had promised years earlier in San Francisco. A couple of days later, we received a telegram that Srila Prabhupada would be arriving in 2 days, and our group was buzzing with excitement. His coming, Tamal Krishna described, was like a comet approaching the earth, a luminous heavenly body being awaited with great anticipation. Mr. Sheikh Saria arranged a procession of cars to receive Prabhupada at the airport and for Prabhupada's car to be covered with yellow marigolds. We greeted Prabhupada with a large kirtan, after which he rode with Mr. Sheikh Saria to Marine Drive. When Prabhupada arrived at Sheikh Saria Bhavan, he was met by a tumultuous reception of 30 devotees who had been waiting in eager anticipation. After acknowledging everyone with nods and smiles and loving glances, he was whisked into one of the elevators and brought up to a bedroom on the 4th floor, though eventually he moved down to the ground level, where he was given another bedroom with an attached bath. Prabhupada was pleased with his quarters at Sheikh Saria Bhavan, with his large rooms overlooking the sea. But personally, I was experiencing some anxiety about all the facilities we were being offered. I felt uncomfortable accepting the rich, opulent prasad and costly varieties of sweets and nuts. Even the elevators seemed a great luxury. I saw other, more senior devotees avail themselves of the facilities, but I was uneasy. And when I did accept something, I sometimes felt guilty afterwards, so I often refrained. I would climb the stairs instead of taking the elevator, and I tried to limit my eating to the most basic, simple prasad. Soon after Prabhupada's arrival, Mr. Sheikh Saria arranged a press conference for him on the 5th floor. sitting up upon a large mattress with a few of his disciples, Prabhupada spoke about his work, focusing on New Vrindavan. And then, when reporters asked about his disciples becoming sadhus and leaving their countries, he called on me to speak. Although I was a little nervous, I was also enlivened and inspired in Prabhupada's presence and told the story of how he had come to Krishna consciousness. The next day, the press was full of stories about Srila Prabhupada and his mission, and the Times of India ran a story referring to my talk under the heading, quote, U.S. millionaire's son seeks solace in Krishna society, unquote, recounting how I had renounced my father's wealth to join Prabhupada's movement. Although the news coverage and public response was generally favorable, some reactionary Hindus wrote letters to the editors, raising objections to Prabhupada's making foreigners into Brahmins and Vaishnavas, and accusing us of being faddists and sentimentalists. In response, Prabhupada dictated points for a reply that, on his instruction, I submitted in my name. The main point is that our society is teaching, here is God, I wrote, and some people do not like that. Generally, people are trying to kill God, push him out of the picture, but we are advertising for God, here is Krishna. Therefore, persons who are envious of God, who want to be God, become our enemies. They see that we are publishing books, acquiring property, and gaining members, and they find fault, but our movement is authorized, scientific, and practical, and it will continue to grow no matter how many speculators raise arguments against us. Prabhupada, I stated, was simply passing on the knowledge that Krishna had imparted to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, which had been passed on unadulterated through an authorized disciplic succession. It was a non-sectarian philosophy that had, quote, nothing to do with any of the faiths that have some historical beginning or end. Krishna is God. God is God. He is not a Hindu or any other faith. No matter one's religion, quote unquote, as Krishna had instructed, the only way to realize God was through devotional service, and the recommended form of devotional service in our age was chanting of God's holy names. Addressing some people's objections that Srila Prabhupada's Western disciples were not true Brahmins, I countered that Lord Chaitanya had taught that one was a Brahmin by qualification, not birth, and we were serious in our endeavor. We were Vaishnavas, I wrote, quote, because we act like Vaishnavas, not because we have taken to wearing saris and churning butter. This is not a sporadic fad of sentimentalists, as has been suggested. How can our movement be sporadic when this science was taught in the Gita 5,000 years ago and the structure of the sun god millions of years before that? How can it be called sporadic when our activity is Sanatana Dharma, the eternal occupation of a living entity? Would faddists give up all meat-eating, intoxication, illicit sex, and gambling for over 5 years now? Would faddists give up friends, family, money, and get up at 4 a.m. daily, ready to go to any country in the world and preach in any conditions immediately on the request of their spiritual master? Paragraph. I quoted Rupa Goswami, who, citing Padma Purana, had stated that Vaishnavas, who were transcendental, actually surpassed ordinary Brahmins who could be conditioned by the modes of goodness. But, I emphasized, we accept the proposal of Lord Chaitanya. I am neither Hindu nor Brahmin nor sannyasi. I am a servant of the servant of the servant of God. Paragraph, continuing, quote, to become a devotee of the Lord is a rare thing, I encourage readers, and everyone knows that there will never be a problem of too many people taking to Krishna consciousness. Actually, there can be no scarcity in God's creation. The only scarcity can be of Krishna consciousness. Therefore, We urge people to change their consciousness, not their occupations. We are working each person according to his natural capacity for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord. Thus, some are running our printing presses, and some are teaching university courses in Krishna consciousness. Some are operating an ideal farm community, modeled after Vrindavan and sheltering hundreds of cows in the USA, while others are preparing the Krishna Prasadam, reserved to thousands of persons daily. Some are on Sankirtan and circulating 500,000 Bhakti Godhead magazines per month in 6 languages. And still others are maintaining our 50 centers of Radha Krishna deity worship all over the world. Actually, we're working harder than anyone. But because we are working for Krishna and not Maya, our work is joyful and free from anxiety. Thousands of new Vaishnavas who are considered already liberated are doing the work of India, which is to present the gift of Krishna consciousness and thereby save the world from gliding to hell. Not only can everyone do this, but they must do it. For this reason, we are traveling to all countries of the world and begging all people to revive their love of God and sing the glories of his name. Unquote. Prabhupada liked my submission, and the skeptics and critics, at least for the time being, seemed to have been silenced. Break. Prabhupada's first preaching engagement in Bombay was at a gathering of sadhus in a pandal, in a vacant plot some blocks from Mr. Seksaria's house, organized by the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. Several other disciples and I went to the pandal a few hours before Prabhupada, and I was startled to see the exotic array of Indian sadhus sitting in rows on long tables. Some of them were bearded, some shaven-headed, some had long matted hair and held tridents. Some were covered with ashes, some adorned with beads and clay markings. Some had sacred texts open before them. I was amazed, and I imagine that many of them, seeing us fair-skinned Vaishnavas, were equally astonished. I had been curious about the holy men of India and how they would compare with Srila Prabhupada, but seeing this assembly of what seemed to me somewhat bizarre-looking fellows, I could see that Prabhupada was a distinct cut above the rest. He was clean, effulgent, and looked grave and dignified, and more than anything else, I could see, without a doubt, he was full of love. When I had joined the Boston Temple, devotees told me that if you looked at Prabhupada's eyes, you would see that they were always wet with tears of love for Krishna. And that was true. I could see it and feel it when I looked at him. Years later, when the Chaitanya Charitamrita was published, I read something similar about Miniketan Ramdas, a great devotee of Lord Nityananda, that his eyes were always brimming with tears. Seeing the motley crew of sadhus sitting on tables at the pandal, I had a realization of Srila Prabhupada's immense stature as a spiritual master. Even though I viewed the others as sages, saintly persons, and yogis, I could see that none of them were like Prabhupada, so effulgent, so compassionate, and so full of grace. We were invited on stage, and when we performed kirtan, the audience responded by chanting and clapping in rhythm. And when, on Mr. Seksaria's advice, we took our kirtan onto the streets, many of the audience followed, and the people outside too responded enthusiastically and joined us in singing and dancing. That evening, we returned to the pandal with Prabhupada, because this is before he got there. Prabhupada sat on a raised platform, and we sat around him at his feet. After having 3 of his disciples speak in English, He spoke in Hindi, and the audience of more than 500 listened in virtual silence. After his lecture, he stepped down from the platform, and a crowd gathered around him, touching his feet and following him to the car. The next day, when Prabhupada heard about the success of our public kirtan, he said that we should go to the busiest areas and chant daily. So, every day after that, wherever large numbers of people gathered, we would go and chant for 3 or 4 hours, while Prabhupada was in his room translating or writing letters or doing other service. I was enthralled by Bombay. Everything felt new and exotic. And from the way people looked at us and how they responded, I think they were enthralled by us too. They would look out from their windows and balconies and rooftops and line the streets, sometimes causing big traffic jams. Prabhupada knew that the people of India wanted to imitate the West, and especially America. So if they saw that Americans took to Krishna consciousness, they would want to do that too. And his strategy worked. Seeing us, Indians reevaluated their own traditions, their own culture and practices, and considered that there must have been more there than even they themselves had thought. Otherwise, why would Americans and Europeans who had every chance to enjoy material facilities and sense gratification be chanting Hare Krishna, dancing, studying Bhagavad Gita, and preaching? Why would they come to India? So they were thrilled, and sometimes when they saw us doing Sankirtan, tears would come to their eyes, and they would be moved to join. I was thrilled to see how Krishna conscious the people were, how traditional their culture and surroundings remained. I'd never seen anything like it. I saw men wearing dhotis and kurtas, and most of the women wore saris. Cows roamed the streets and lazed on the sidewalks and mediums, and many of the names of the buildings and businesses included names of Krishna and Ram. We were captivated by it all, but at the same time we were filled with a sense that we were pioneers in Srila Prabhupada's mission to revitalize Krishna consciousness in India, working to serve him and please him according to his superior guidance and vision. And we had faith that the whole process would culminate in wonderful results. We didn't have to go far to create a sensation. All we had to do was step out the door of Sheksarya Bhavan, which we dubbed Krishna Mahal, and people would gather around us. They were so eager to see us that sometimes we would just go out front, and they would gather up around to hear us chant, and then one of us might speak to the crowd. Sometimes we would do that while waiting to leave for a program, or upon returning. We were all so full of enthusiasm to chant the holy names and preach. As I wrote in an article for a special All India issue of BTG under the heading Krishna Returns to India, quote, when the Hare Krishna chanters first appeared in America 5 years ago, Americans were surprised, dressed in, quote, Indian dhotis and saris and chanting Hindu chants in Sanskrit. They were a novelty, but when they braved the winter, snow, and freezing temperatures to perform their Sankirtan, people had to take them seriously. Now it was time for the Indians to be surprised. For the first time in many years, Indians in the downtown sectors of India's major cities are seeing the same performance of Sankirtan as taught and popularized by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who invented himself in India and West Bengal 480 years ago. Yet, instead of seeing Indians chanting, as one would expect in India, the Indians are astonished to see the chanters are actually Americans and Europeans, dressed in traditional garb of Indian sadhus or holy men. These American and European devotees are following the Vedic system even more strictly than the Indians. By dint of their determination and eagerness to chant the Lord's praises, Indians are beginning to understand the purpose of their chanting. No longer are the devotees viewed as curiosities or public entertainment, as they were taken to be when first appearing in the West. The serious purpose of the Krishna consciousness movement is a wonderful and welcome surprise to all. These surprises, this is still a quote from his article, these surprises are the mercy of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who came to America 5 years ago from India and just recently has returned to India from the West. Unquote. Break. This is really readable, isn't it? One evening, we had a program on the roof of Seksarya Bhavan with the elite of Bombay, invited by Kailash Seksarya. Although he had expected the guests to number only 200 at most, many more came. After Kirtan, Prabhupada spoke about his work in the West and then quoted Chaitanya Chandramrita 8.90. Dante Nihaya Trinakam Padayor Nipatya. Taking a straw between my teeth and falling at your feet 100 times, I humbly submit, oh, great personality, please give up all the mundane knowledge that you have learned and just submit yourself at the lotus feet of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you are all so highly qualified. You are all so much devoted, and you have such good qualities in all respects. You are all intelligent, learned, and educated. You are very great persons, I beg you. I take the straw of the street between my teeth, and I beg you, just chant Hare Krishna. Please chant Hare Krishna. He was begging them on the spot. I was moved and humbled by Prabhupada's earnestness, humility, and compassion. After his talk, Prabhupada left, and we gave a slideshow of ISKCON's activities around the world. That night, several of the guests, including the prominent industrialist G.D. Somani and Kailash Seksarya, became life members and received a collection of Srila Prabhupada's books. A few days later, there was another gathering of sadhus and spiritual leaders on Chaupati Beach. Prabhupada and his disciples were seated on a stage that had been erected right on the sand. Prabhupada sat with the 20 or so sadhus. The rest of us were in rows toward the back. Two prominent Mayavadis expounded impersonal philosophy. And then came Prabhupada, the last scheduled speaker. But instead of addressing the audience, he told us, begin chanting. When we began the kirtan, little Saraswati, Shyamasundar Malati's 2-year-old daughter, stood up and began to dance. Following her, the rest of us devotees rose and danced as well. As the kirtan grew, the drangas and kartals, one by one, the sadhus on stage rose and left. The audience, however, responded enthusiastically, many of them standing and clapping, and after 5 minutes, we jumped down onto the sand and headed toward them. Thousands in the crowd rose to their feet and began to move backward and forward, singing and clapping. So moved were they that many began crying in happiness, overwhelmed by our ecstatic devotion. They had never seen anything like this. Even policemen and press reporters joined in the chanting and dancing. Chaupati Beach was in an uproar of Hare Krishna Kirtan. Have you read this already? No? After the Kirtan, the crowd took some time to settle back down. Then Prabhupada's voice boomed over the public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I was requested to speak in Hindi, but I'm not very much accustomed to speak in Hindi. Therefore, the authorities in this meeting have allowed me to speak in English. I hope you will follow me because it is Bombay and most people speak English. The problem is, as the evening speaker, His Holiness Swami Akhanadanda Ji said, how can we make everyone accustomed to take up good habits, sadachar, in this age of Kali? There are many faults. He went on to explain the power of Lord Chaitanya's movement to cleanse the hearts of everyone and referred to the two great rogues whom Lord Chaitanya had delivered, Jagai and Madhai. Now we are saving wholesale Jagais and Madhais. Therefore, if we want peace, if we want to be situated on the Sadachar platform, we must spread the Harinam Mahamantra all over the world. And it has been practically proven. The American and European Vaishnavas who have come here, who have chanted Hare Krishna mantra, they were cow flesh eaters, they were drunkards, they were illicit sex mongers, and they were all kinds of gamblers, but have taken to this Krishna consciousness movement. They have given up everything abominable. Sadachar has come automatically. They are no more meat eaters, they are no more gamblers, etc. They do not even take tea, they do not even take coffee, they do not even smoke, which is, I think, very rare to be found in India. But they have given up. Why? Because they have taken to this Krishna consciousness. I do not feel that I have to say very much, he concluded. You can see what is the result of Krishna consciousness. It is not something artificial. It is there in everyone. I have not done anything magical, but this Krishna consciousness is present in all of us. We simply have to revive it. The applause responded with cheers. The audience responded with cheers and applause. Prabhupada had shown the essence of spiritual life, ecstatic chanting of the holy names, and had presented us as living testimony. It was wonderful to feel of use to his mission. The Times weekly coverage of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj highlighted Srila Prabhupada and his disciples' participation. Quote, a group of 20 Americans, members of the Hare Krishna delegation, took over the dais. I think that's how you pronounce it. Dais? Okay. The air was filled with the beating of mridangas, the clash of cymbals, the music of the Mahamantra, swaying from side to side, their tufts of hair tossing in the breeze. They chanted Hare Krishna. This is now still a quote from the article. One graying reporter whom I had always regarded as a particularly unsentimental person said to me in an emotion-choked voice, do you realize what is happening? Very soon Hinduism is going to sweep the West. The Hare Krishna movement will compensate for all our loss at the hands of padres through the centuries, unquote. Jamuna recounted, Srila Prabhupada's interplay with us at this time was truly wondrous. I can only describe him as being like a conductor with many devotee instruments, watching each of us carefully and directing the rhythms and tenors of our individual services. He knew our strengths and weaknesses, tried to bring out the best in each of us, and protected us. We felt that we couldn't have figured out anything regarding the day-to-day adjustments to be in India without his constant guidance. He set the example of how to live and how to behave, and he allowed us access to him nearly 24 hours a day. Srila Prabhupada's energy level at this time was so beyond description. Here he was in his 70s, while we were all in our 20s or less, and yet he worked circles around us. He was present, alert, and up each night until after midnight, translating. Then he had a full day of activities, including instructing us, writing, sending letters around the world, meeting with important men, inspiring devotees, doing preaching programs, and of course, his daily personal sadhana. It was simply inconceivable, and yet he did this every day, regardless of where he was. I was only in Bombay for under 2 weeks, but for those 2 weeks were two of the most powerful of my life, because Srila Prabhupada allowed us to taste kirtan in Lord Chaitanya's Bharata Varsha, Lord Krishna's. The effect of the enthusiastic and powerful chanters of the Sankirtan party was immediate and extraordinary. We were all like tight family, with each person playing a specific role. Malati's, quote, Prabhupada's World Sankirtan banner, along with one bearing the Mahamantra, announced or introduced us to thousands who heard us in the streets. We were shoulder to shoulder, just like God brothers and God sisters, with so much affection and respect for each other. We felt like Srila Prabhupada was our father, and we were all his spiritual children, and there was such a nice mood. It was really burning hot for us in India, but we chanted until we almost couldn't chant anymore. And then our host, Kailash Seksarya, would come with big urns of cold nimbu pani, and we'd get rejuvenated. Still, it's quoting Jamuna. From the very beginning of our programs in Bombay, Srila Prabhupada became known as one who's startling India with kirtan. Our kirtans were full of so much excitement. They were so thrilling that we were like one throbbing heartbeat, the heartbeat of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission of Krishna consciousness. It is difficult to describe how much potency we felt in the kirtans, not just in the chanting itself, but in how the chanting was being received by others. It was amazing how clearly we could see the chanting changing the hearts and psyches of so many people, and this spurred us on even more, like a holistic circle. The dynamic circle of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan movement. We took to heart the process of our Guru Maharaj gave us, practiced it, and gave it to others through our Harinam Sankirtan, and then saw it act on their hearts. It was truly a magical, wonderful thing, and I felt so privileged to be part of it. That's the end of the quote from Jamuna. Now back to Giriraj. Practically from the time I had joined, our lives had revolved around Sankirtan, and at no time, nowhere, had that been more true than during that period in Bombay. Then suddenly one day Prabhupada told us, quote, no more street Sankirtan. In India, if we chant on the streets, people will think that we are beggars. We were shocked, stunned, and dismayed. We had been taught that this was the Sankirtan movement. Tamal Krishna remembered, by 1970, active street Sankirtan, chanting Hare Krishna on the streets and distributing Back to Godhead magazines, had been going on for a year and a half. When we arrived in India that year, we applied the same formula. We chanted Hare Krishna on the streets, but some people ridiculed us. And there were newspaper articles in the same mood. When Prabhupada heard this, and he heard that people were throwing coins at us, he told us immediately to stop doing daily Sankirtan because people were taking it cheaply. ... Prabhupada was willing to completely adjust the fundamental strategy of street chanting if it didn't have the desired effect, unquote. Tamal Krishna Maharaj. Back to Giriraj. Srila Prabhupada explained that we must approach the higher sections of society with his books and especially through life membership. And he led the way, personally enrolling life members and presenting them with his books, or arranging for us to do so as he had on the terrace of the Seksarya Bhavan. Whenever and wherever he had a program, he wanted his books displayed, and he would almost always speak about them or have one of us do so. Paragraph. Prabhupada also spoke at Prem Kutir, which consisted of not only a hall for satsangas, but also guest facilities for sadhus. Prabhupada had stayed there before going to America. The facility was run by an industrialist, Hari Krishna Das Agarwal. I was thrilled that someone could have the name Hari Krishna Das, who greeted us warmly when we arrived and later gave us a tour of the premises, showing us where Prabhupada had translated Srimad Bhagavatam. There was another sadhu already speaking on the platform with a large build, long black hair, and a beard. He was a sort of devotee of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He had huge kartals, which we call wampers, and he would chant, Haribol, Haribol, and clash the wampers together. His name was Vairagi Baba, and Prabhupada took a liking to him and tried to engage him. After we had been in Bombay for 10 days, Mr. Agarwal invited Prabhupada and his party to Amritsar for a Vedanta Sammelan conference, at which people would gather to hear sadhus speak on or speculate about Vedanta. Prabhupada accepted. And on October 20, he and a party of his disciples, 7 men and 2 women, were on a train headed north to Amritsar. The Vedanta ashram was dedicated to the propagation of impersonal Mayavad philosophy, and the buildings and walkways displayed signs with popular Mayavad slogans such as Tattvamasi and Aham Brahmasmi. We were provided 2 small rooms and the use of a common courtyard. Prabhupada occupied one room, and Yamuna and Kaushalya the other, and the men slept either in the courtyard or in a large hall for sadhus. We had programs in the evening, and every morning we would go into Prabhupada's room and sing Guruvastakam prayers in front of his Radha Krishna deities, after which he would speak with us. One morning, he explained the different Mayavad slogans. The organizers knew that he did not agree with their philosophy, he told us, but they had invited him and his disciples because they had been known that the foreign devotees' kirtan would attract people. Prabhupada, they would talk and talk about Vedanta, but it is simply mental speculation, and they never come to any conclusion. Just then, one of the ladies removed the food offering she had made to Srila Prabhupada's deities and put the plate in front of him. He continued, "They will go on speculating for many lifetimes." He popped the Mahasweet into his mouth. "But we will realize God simply by eating." Is there a chapter ending or something like that? There's an else. Okay, it will end with Amritsar. In Amritsar, Guru Das was our main preacher. One evening, when to refute an impersonal philosophy, he told the audience, quote, "If it's all one, then why don't you give me your wife to enjoy?" Guru Das' example offended the Indians' sensibilities, so the organizers asked Prabhupada to assign another disciple to speak. And Prabhupada chose me. So every evening I would speak, and one morning I happened to pass Prabhupada while he was getting massage outside his quarters, and he said, "I heard your talk last night. You spoke very nicely." And from then on, while we were traveling, he would sometimes ask me to speak at public programs. Whenever he did, I was always pray that my words would be pleasing to him, because I knew that if he was pleased, Krishna would be pleased, and the audience would progress in Krishna consciousness, and I would pray to the Paramatma, the Lord within the hearts of all the people listening, to inspire them to receive my message, Srila Prabhupada and Lord Krishna's message, favorably. So that's page 16. And they're about to depart Amritsar. And it's 7:30. I think an hour is good. And you're driving back to Boston tomorrow? Kind of ended up different than you had thought it would be, but who knew? It's been like that for all of us. Yeah, been... Okay, so we're going to do this, Yagya?
Yes.
Okay.